Today on Blue 58, organized team activities are happening in Green Bay. Let's check in on a few of the storylines we should be watching.
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I am happy to be with you here for another episode because we've got something resembling football happening in Green Bay. Just as a reminder, the Packers are having their organized team activities right now. Well, not technically right now, but today they're having them. Organized team activities May 20th and 21st, as well as the 23rd. They get a day off between days 1 and 2 and 3. Then next week, it's the 28th and 29th, as well as the 31st. They're back the following week for June 3rd and 4th, and then the 6th. And then minicamp is June 11th through the 13th. I don't want to go super in-depth on organized team activities just because I think we all understand that everyone knows that this is practice, but I mean, it's even stretching the definition of we're talking about practice if you want to go to Allen Iverson land. But it's a data point. Maybe not a super significant one, but it is a data point. And speaking of data points, I think the first training camp storyline we want to be keeping an eye on, or OTA storyline we want to be keeping an eye on, is who's the first offensive line group up? Who's getting the first crack at things on the offensive line? And it turns out, at least according to Andy Herman, who's on the ground there at OTAs today, it's from left to right: Rasheed Walker, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, Sean Ryan, and Andre Dillard getting the start at right tackle. I think this tells us a couple things. First, they don't think Jordan Morgan is part of their best five right now, which is, I think, fine. It's OTAs. It doesn't really matter. Secondly, we're probably looking at Morgan as a right tackle. If they don't have Zach Tom, Dillard is at right tackle, so they're not moving anything around other than him. So I think if we're going to get a look at Morgan in the short term, it's going to be at tackle. Now that could change if Zach Tom is back and they move Morgan inside to guard. Who knows what happens? I saw that Kadeem Telford, the giant tackle from was it UAB, was playing some guard at OTAs today. That is taking cross training to an extreme level. But things are going to move around. We're just getting a couple glimpses of what's possible here. It could mean anything. The second thing I think we should keep an eye on throughout OTAs is just a vibe check on defense. People are going to say that everybody looks good, that this person is doing this, that this person is doing that. Maybe it means something, maybe it doesn't. But I think we just want a feel for what the defense is going to do and how they're acting and what they say and do relative to, their new coach here on defense. I think that's kind of the trend that we're looking for here. Stuff that happens on the field could not matter less right now, but we want to see how people react to what they're doing on the field. So let's see how the players are reacting to what's going on the field as well. Then the third and final storyline of the early OTAs here is kicker stuff. We've got 3 kickers on the roster, and competition is officially underway. Your kickers for the Green Bay Packers right now: Anders Carlson, Greg Joseph, and Jack Podlesny. I would suspect that Podlesny is probably not super long for this competition. If he shows something really early, that's his only real ticket to sticking around past OTAs, maybe into minicamp. I would expect that by the time we get to training camp, if it even takes that long, the Packers are going to be down to 2 kickers just because they probably want as many reps as possible between Carlson and Joseph. That's the real competition here. All respect in the world to Jack Podlesny for being on an NFL roster, but this is the real competition is between Carlson and Joseph. So let's see how long Podlesny is able to last and what the Packers bring in to replace him if and when the time comes. Just have an open mind through OTAs, see what happens. Once training camp rolls around, we'll see what we can really drill down on and learn about this Packers team. I have a few questions before I want to introduce one of our off-season projects here. Jonko writes in via our Patreon, is it a safe bet to feel confident in our new defensive coordinator? A good defense adds points and is half the game, making life easier for the offense. I guess we'll see game 1 in Brazil. I don't know what I'm really looking for from Hafley right now, other than that people feel good about playing for Hafley. Let's not be swayed by the rah-rah stuff. I mean, everybody talked about how exciting it was to be around Joe Barry early on in his tenure. I think it probably was just a contrast between him and Mike Pettin. Pettin was fairly taciturn, despite his stern face was fairly quiet. very stoic in some ways. To his credit at times, I think that's a good quality to have as a coach in certain circumstances. But Barry was a real rah-rah guy early on in Green Bay, and it turned out to kind of just be a lot of talk, which is how things work out for a lot of coaches. I mean, everybody has an idea. Those ideas don't always work. So what are we looking for with Jeff Hafley? On balance, I think you're just looking for some positive regression. You're looking for the Packers to improve to maybe a more average level in some areas where they weren't quite so good under Joe Barry. The two that stick out to me, if you look at where Joe Barry's defenses were weak, were especially last season takeaways and, generally speaking, run defense. The run defense speaks for itself. That was always a weakness of the Packers under Joe Barry. But the takeaways, and specifically ball hawks, just general plays on the ball, so we're talking sacks, forced fumbles, interceptions, and passes defensed, were on the decline throughout all of the Joe Barry era, finishing with 129 in 2023. That's lower than the 140, which was their recent high in 2021, and just barely higher than the 126 they had in 2022. In fact, that figure is the lowest we've got on record, those two, 126 in 22 and 129 in 23, since the truly awful seasons in 2017 and 2018, 122 and 118 respectively in both of those years, and you will remember that they only had 16 games in those two seasons, so not too much better than a couple seasons where they had they were an entire game short of where they were in 22 and 23. So that's where you would look to see some real improvement from Hafley's defense, taking the ball away, making plays on the ball in general, and slowing down the run defense. So if they can just be closer to average on that, if they can just get back up to where they were in terms of plays on the ball, at least to 2021 territory, and kind of smooth it out across a few games instead of just getting them in bunches, I think they're on their way to a much better defense. And I think, generally speaking, there's reason for hope here, too. The safety should be better. At the very least, they have more options at linebacker than they had in 2023, and hopefully they're going to have more stability in corner. Those are three big upgrades, personnel-wise, than what we had in 2023. It should get things closer to level. Let's put it that way. Barry's defenses could be pretty volatile. Like some weeks he would get a shutdown performance out of nowhere, and then the next week they just get worked over randomly. That was the Barry experience, and you never knew, though you could always suspect, when the rupture was going to happen. Hopefully just a little bit more consistency, and I'm using the word level a lot, but I feel like that's where we're trying to get to with Hafley, just even things out a little bit. If the defense could be more consistent week to week, quarter to quarter, drive to drive, that's a big step in the right direction, and just I think you'll see a trend in a positive direction on some of those numbers. Mike offers us a very, very flattering question and a very interesting one, too, that gives us a lot to think about here. Mike writes in, being that you probably have more influential contacts than I do, I want to pass along an idea that I have. The first week of NFL football, everyone is going to watch no matter what, so there's really no reason to have special matchups like Bears versus Packers. The first game is really the first time the starters have to play together for the whole game, and sometimes it's ugly, like when the Packers got beat by the Saints a few years ago. I remember that. 2021 was off to a rough start. In fact, in that game, the Packers didn't even play in New Orleans. They played the Saints in Jacksonville because of the hurricane that relocated that game. Just a weird start to the season, especially just a couple weeks after Aaron Rodgers had his big airing of grievance press conferences. Anyway, back to Mike's question, or suggestion here. Suggestion, he says, the first game of the year is always AFC versus NFC. So if you lose, it's not such a big deal. If you lose against another team in your conference, it's a bigger loss with more ramifications. If you know anyone that has influence and you like my idea, pass it on. Well, I do like the idea. And I'm grateful that you think that I have that kind of pull. But the best I can do as far as passing it along is talking about it on this show. Here's what I would say. The NFL does like games with stakes in week one because it is a more exciting game. It does give you some excitement if there's something a little bit on the line. However, I do agree with Mike's observation here that sometimes you do have some pretty sloppy football in week one, and I think this could be an opportunity to showcase some of what Mike McCarthy would call uncommon opponents here. Everybody's going to have them in their schedule. The Packers, for instance, play the Titans this year. That's not somebody we see a whole lot. Packers-Titans in week one could be an interesting game. I don't know if the NFL would commit hard and fast to that kind of rule, but I do like thinking about these sort of games or these sort of things. I like the idea of shaking up the schedule a little bit and putting like some landmarks within the schedule. Like first week, like Mike says, could be AFC, NFC. We already have something like that in the last 2 weeks of the season being divisional games, and that was a relatively recent change for the NFL. I've loved it. It's been great. Just look how many times in recent Packers history the last week of the season has mattered. They've had some great games with the Lions. They had to beat the Bears last year. They had to beat the Bears and the Vikings technically last year to get to the playoffs. It makes for some exciting football down the stretch, even if you're in a situation or like in Week 17. And forgive me, Vikings fans, I'm not trying to rag on you if you're a Vikings fan listening to this, but the Vikings weren't any good last year. It added some stakes to it where the Packers had to take care of business against a team that they probably should beat just to make sure that they got things done and got into the playoffs. Those are some stakes that matter. So tweaking these schedules like this could give you some interesting stuff to look at throughout the season. Let's look at some more possibilities. What if you made it so every week, or at least once per team per year, you play a neutral site game? We got international stuff for sure. The Packers have played in London. The NFL is sending people to London all the time, but they've also done games in Germany. They've had some flirting and I think preseason games. Did they play a regular season game recently in Mexico City? That's been on the NFL's radar for a while. You could do Toronto if you really wanted to. The Bills were looking at that a couple of years back, maybe even playing some permanent home games in Toronto. The NFL has flirted with Japan in the past. There is a fairly substantial Japanese American football fan base. I know there's at least one Japanese language Packers podcast out there. If you want to check that out, I don't speak any Japanese, so that would be lost on me, but I'm glad that it exists. I know of a Russian language one too. Packers fans from all over the world in all languages, welcome. Start your podcast, start your shows, get them out there. So that's stuff that the NFL could look at. And I think you could even expand that out if you expanded your definition of what a neutral site game is. There are a lot of considerations, but just to throw this idea out there, and I know there's a lot of different logistical things that would go into this, but what about playing at college stadiums? What if you had the Packers play at Camp Randall one year, or Packers and Lions, in my backyard, relatively speaking, at the Big House in Ann Arbor, Michigan? I know the Lions probably wouldn't want to give up a home game to do that, but what if, with your 9-game potential home schedule here, you could have something like that where teams are playing at neutral sites. If you want to showcase the game, if you want to grow your audience here, you might have to do things like that. And if you want to expand or look at some potential expansion markets, this is not a bad way to go about that. Because if you're not going to build a new stadium right off the bat, you're going to have to play somewhere. Just look at some options out there and see what you can find. You never know what's out there till you look, and if everything sounds crazy until you try it. But I think the neutral site games is something that could really work, and if you stuck it would be fun to do it right at the middle of the season, like this mid-season festival, like week 8 for everybody, or week 9. You have everybody at a neutral site game, and you can make it a real event. That could be a lot of fun. But I don't know, maybe it's completely harebrained idea, but you try some stuff and you add some interesting wrinkles and landmarks and stuff like that to the calendar. Who knows? Maybe it ends up being good. Finally, Old Packers fans asks whether there's any possibility of using Marshawn Lloyd on kickoff. He writes, the new kickoff rule promotes the use of players who can make people miss as well as run through tackles. Keyshawn Nixon is a good returner, but also a slot starter. Having a bigger body may be necessary to succeed with kickoffs under the new rule. Any thoughts? I like the thinking here. Another big-bodied guy could be interesting. I've proposed stuff like that in the past with the new kickoff rule. I thought Jeff Janis really would have thrived under this kind of rule. We talked about Najee Davenport being a good kick returner for the Packers in the early 2000s, in addition to being a solid number 2 for the Packers in the backfield. I think putting a bigger-bodied guy back there could be really interesting. Having the flexibility is the good thing. I think we just got to see what this new kickoff is all about. We're going to have to feel this out. You can game out the theory and stuff on it all you want, but we got to see it in action before we figure out what the Packers are going to do and what they should do. I think it looks like the kickoff rule seems built to have 2 guys back there returning. I don't know for sure, but it looks like that's going to be part of the plan, like having two solid returners back there. If Keyshawn Nixon is your number one guy and they're trying to kick away from him, how do you do that with shorter space to operate? We'll see what happens, and anything could be good. So let's explore all options. Before we get into the last thing I wanted to cover today, I wanted to give another shout out to our means of support here at Blue 58. Check us out at patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com. Going to give a shout out to some of our bonus content there. One piece a week every Friday, and we're doing a bunch of series throughout the offseason. Right now we're looking at all the uniforms in the AFC, deciding the best look and worst look for every AFC team. We've done the AFC North. We did the AFC East last Friday. Coming up after that, after we finish all this look at the uniform stuff, we're going to have an Ask Me Anything. We do that once a quarter. So June here, we're going to get another look at an Ask Me Anything here. You can ask whatever's on your mind, and I'll do my best to answer it. And then we're going to do a series on revamping the Carolina Panthers. We had someone in our Discord server ask if I could fix the Carolina Panthers, what would I do? And I thought that's a good idea for a series of content. So we're going to write about that a little bit and see what people think. So patreon.com/thepowersweep. Support at any dollar amount that you want. If you hit certain thresholds, you're going to get some merch in the mail at some point here. Patreon is handling all that fulfillment, so it'll take a little bit of time, but it's going to get out to everybody at all the thresholds, so I'm excited about that. Going to get the bonus content every week, and you're going to have access to our Discord server and be able to talk to Packers fans from all over the world. So check it out. There's links in the description of this episode and at thepowersweep.com. I would appreciate your consideration there, and if that's not what you choose to do, that's fine as well. So, for the remainder of the offseason, we've got basically 2 months here, I would guess, until training camp starts. Until we get rolling with actual football and stuff like that, I want to do a little bit of learning about different areas of the Packers roster. So I've tasked myself each week to come up with a couple of little research projects about every position. Last week was kind of our soft beginning, talking a little bit more historically about the Packers' decision to draft Jordan Love, looking at the context around that. I want to do a little bit more research on the individual positions on the Packers and things just maybe that you might not know or realize about each of these individual positions, running back, wide receiver, tight end, whatever's going on defense, stuff like that, and some of the stats that we look at to track those positions as well. Related to that, we've arrived at running backs here. So we're going to go try to alternate offense, defense every week, but this is where we're at to start here. I want to start talking a little bit about the historical context for Josh Jacobs joining the Packers, because he's got the opportunity to do something pretty unique in Packers history. He's already a pretty unique back in Packers history. They haven't had a big-name free agent signing at that position in as long as I can remember. Really, as long as I've been a Packers fan, they've really not gone out and said, we are signing a high-end running back, and we're going to make him, the star of the show here in Green Bay. For a while, they had flirtations. This is more than a decade ago already, but they had flirtations with Steven Jackson, who ended up signing with the Atlanta Falcons. The offseason, the Packers drafted Eddie Lacy, so 2013. They brought in Cedric Benson in 2012, one of the former very, very high draft pick, but he was at the end of his career and only played less than half a season in Green Bay. He's since passed on. That's a very, very sad news a couple of years ago, I think in a motorcycle accident, although that may have been Terry Glenn as well. But you see these football players that you grew up watching or watched as a young adult meeting their untimely end, and that's depressing. Didn't mean to bring that in the show. But anyway, the Packers brought him in. They had Keanu Carter, who was a great player at Penn State, and then tore up his knee very early in his NFL career and just kind of limped to the end there and was in Green Bay for a little while. But really, we haven't seen them shell out a ton of money for a guy that did not play for them before. And if Jacobs ends up cracking the top 25 in Packers rushing history, he will be just the second back to do so, having taken a carry for a team other than the Packers before arriving in Green Bay. The other one is Ahman Green, who of course ended up being the Packers' all-time leading rusher. But he started his career with Seattle before fumbling issues drew the ire of Mike Holmgren, understandably, and he got shipped off to Green Bay. I think it worked out for both parties, a win-win trade there. Ryan Grant nearly makes it on a technicality. The Packers traded for Grant prior to the 2007 season, but he was with the Giants for 2005 and 2006, despite never playing a down for them, at least not in the regular season. I had forgotten this aspect, but I mean, if you're afraid of gruesome injuries at all, I'll give you a chance to skip ahead a little bit here. But he missed the entire 2006 season with a pretty grim-sounding injury. I'll read you the description here in just a second. I want to give you one last chance to jump ahead. Okay. He started the 2005 season on the practice squad for the Giants. However, this is the Wikipedia write-up. After a, quote, non-football-related injury threatened his career, he never played a regular season game for the Giants. Grant was at a nightclub when someone bumped into him. When he went to brace himself, his left arm went through several champagne glasses, severing an artery, a tendon, and the ulnar nerve in his left arm. Grant was at risk of bleeding to death, and doctors at the time told him he might not regain the use of his left hand, although he did recover, end quote. Personally, one of my life goals is to avoid ever having to use the word sever with regard to any of my body parts. I think that would be a great thing to achieve. Anyhow, that gruesome rabbit hole aside, Jacobs is set to join some pretty unique history in company in Packers history. Put a pin in that. We'll come back to that aspect. I wanted to talk about Josh Jacobs' achievements as a dual threat back. One of the things that he and Matt LaFleur have both talked about in regard to his time in Green Bay is that they want to get him a little bit more involved in the passing game that he was in Las Vegas with the Raiders. Very nearly said Oakland, did not. They want him more involved as a receiver than he was as a member of the Raiders, not the radar. Let me put this on your radar about what he did with the Raiders. So I wanted to take a look at that. How does he stack up against some of the other dual threat guys in Packers history? Well, I set the threshold for dual threat as someone who's had at least 100 carries in a season while also having 20 catches in the same season. And I charted out all of those seasons this morning by yards per rush and yards per catch. I wanted to see who was consistently threatening defenses through the air and on the ground. There were 71 seasons in Packers history, individual seasons, not just years in Packers history. But there were 71 seasons in Packers history where guys had at least 100 carries and 20 catches in the year, or in a given year. All 5 of Jacobs' seasons so far meet those thresholds. And we'll compare them here for a second to some of the people kind of in his neighborhood in terms of yards per rush and yards per catch. His 2 best seasons are 2019 and 2022. In 2019, he averaged 4.8 yards per carry and 8.3 yards per catch. By far his best year, I think. 2022 is pretty close. 4.9 yards per carry and 7.5 yards per catch. His closest neighbors, I think, are what you would call, in terms of just overall raw productivity, some of the like second-tier guys in absolute Packers history here. 2021, Aaron Jones is pretty close to Jacobs' numbers there, his closest neighbors on the chart. And I'm going to post this chart at thepowersweep.com probably Wednesday, so keep an eye out for that. I'll put it up there so everybody can see. But 4.7 per carry and 7.5 per catch for Aaron Jones in 2021. The other closest neighbor for Jacobs in those 2 years was 1996 Dorsey Levens, who averaged 4.7 per carry and 7.3 per catch. That's pretty good company to keep. The other 3 seasons for Jacobs in his career, 2023, 2021, and 2020, are not quite as good. 2023 averaged 3.5 yards per carry. There are a number of reasons for that. We don't have to go into that. That's just the raw numbers. 3.5 yards per carry, 8 yards per catch. His closest comp for that was 1966 Jim Taylor, who averaged 3.5 per carry and 8 per catch. 2021, he averaged 4 yards per carry, 6.4 yards per catch. Closest comp was 1992 Vince Workman, 4 per carry, 6.2 per catch. And then in 2020, he averaged 3.9 yards per carry and 7.2 yards per catch. The closest comp there, Jamal Williams in 2018, who averaged 3.8 per carry and 7.8 yards per catch. Any takeaways here? At his best, I think we can say that statistically at least, Jacob stacks up at a level just below some of the very best to ever do it. Only one person in Packers history has actually ever cracked 5 yards per catch and 8 yards, or 5 yards per carry and 8 yards per catch at those 100 carry, 20 catch thresholds. It was Jerry Ellis in 1985. He averaged 5.5 yards per carry and 8.6 yards per catch. Aaron Jones came close twice, real close. He was at 5.5 per carry in both 2018 and 2020, and averaged 7.9 and 7.6 yards per catch, respectively. So Jacobs, at his best, is just below some of those seasons. There are a couple other seasons that are a little bit better than what Jacobs has put up, but he's pretty close to the best that we've seen in terms of dual-threat backs in Packers history. And if the Packers can squeeze a little bit more out of him in those areas, we're looking at something that could be really, really unique in Packers history as well. At his best, again, he's right there at the top. At his worst, his stat line looks like a guy who played in a different era of football. I mean, Jim Taylor looked like a force of nature, averaging 3.5 yards per carry. Those were not his best seasons, but late career, Jim Taylor was averaging in that area. It looked quite a bit different in the 60s than it would in 2024, averaging 3.5 yards per carry. So that's not what we're looking for Jacobs, and I'm sure not what he's looking for either. It is more middle area. I think Josh Jacobs statistically profiles a lot like Jamal Williams, and I think that's a pretty good place for you to be. Jamal Williams, a very useful back for the Packers. You always wished he could have been a little bit more explosive, but the thing that we always said about Williams is he may not, give you all of those explosive plays that Aaron Jones gets you, but Jamal Williams rarely ever, if ever, made a bad play for you. He was not really even a boom or bust back, always just middle of the road, solid in pass protection, reliable hands as a receiver. It's a pretty good place to be if you're going to be right there with Jamal Williams. Sure, you would look for more yards per carry there, but ultimately I think I like two of those three outcomes because I think Jacobs is probably more explosive than Williams ever was, and if he can be as good as a receiver and a pass blocker, you've got somebody pretty good there. The second aspect of this kind of relates to the Amon Green portion of this, as we alluded to up top. Throwing out his best season, which was 2022, where he ran for more than 1,600 yards, and his worst season, which was 2023, where he rushed for only 805 yards, Jacobs has rushed for just over 3,000 yards in his career, 3,087 to be precise, or on average about 1,000 per season. Given his contract, he's going to be in Green Bay for 2 and probably 3 seasons, at least. If he stays healthy, who knows how long he could be in Green Bay. If he puts up another 3,000 yards, where would that put him historically? 3,000 yards exactly, if he hit that exact number in his Green Bay career, would put him just past Eddie Lee Ivory for 15th all-time in Packers history. Ivory has 2,933 yards in his career. If he got to 3,500 yards, he would just pass both Aaron Rodgers and Eddie Lacy for 11th all-time. Rodgers finished his Packers career with 3,466 yards. Lacy, 3,435. Rodgers had 34 rushing yards over his final 8 games in Green Bay, just passing Eddie Lacy. Unfortunately, I think all things being considered, I would love it if Eddie Lacy could have been a little bit higher on the all-time leaderboard. As an aside to that aside, I wish that Ted Thompson had done a little bit better job with roster management in Eddie Lacy's final season in Green Bay so that he didn't have to play essentially the entire game, his final game in Green Bay on a bad ankle, which ended up breaking, which ended up leading to the end of his tenure in Green Bay. An injury that didn't have to happen because the Packers did not manage their running back resources well, carrying only 2 backs into a game when Lacy was already hurt, and then James Starks got hurt, so Lacy was the only guy there. They had no choice but to run him, and he got hurt. He put it on the line for the Packers, and it cost him, I think, quite a bit of money. Unfortunate, but that's how things worked out. If Jacobs gets to 4,000 yards, he would just pass Dorsey Levens for the top 7 in Packers history, also passing Paul Hornung and Clark Hinkle along the way. And if he wants to get into the top 5, he's got to essentially crack 4,200 yards over his time in Green Bay. Tony Canadeo, currently 5th in Packers history. I don't think he's going to add any more yards, so finishing at 5th in Packers history, let's put it that way, with 4,197 yards, and Ryan Grant at 4,143. To get there, he would need to average 1,399 yards over 3 seasons or 1,050 per year over 4. 1,399 yards is just over 82 yards per game, and 1,050 is just under 62 yards per game over 4 seasons. It's doable, and I think if this signing goes well and Josh Jacobs stays healthy and does all of those things, we could be talking about one of the better offensive free agent signings in Packers history, probably in the 21st century, to be sure, because he'll be threatening some of the Packers, top runners in their history if he's able to stay healthy and produce like I think the Packers are hoping that he will. So I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. It's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in the conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.